Hi, my name is Matt Croasmun, and thanks for joining us for Books on Faith and Meaning at Grace Farms. There is a lot to be worried about these days. The whelming climate crisis, war and its associated ills, forced migration across the globe, social injustices along lines of race and class, gender and disability. In choosing freedom, in our book for today, our guest for today, Karen Stohr, says that, quote, if you are feeling gloomy about the state of the world and are looking for a ray of optimism, Immanuel Kant may well be the philosopher you need. And indeed, it seems to me hope, especially hope for moral improvement, whether our own or others, or the moral improvement of the world at large, that may be something that's in short supply, something that we need. So I'm excited for this conversation today. Our guest, Karen Stohr, is the Ryan Family Professor of Metaphysics and Moral Philosophy and Senior Research Scholar at Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. She is author of numerous articles and 3 books on manners, Minding the Gap, Moral Ideals and Moral Improvement, and our book for today, Choosing Freedom, a Kantian Guide to Life. Karen, if I may, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
You say, you sort of warn us right from the beginning that if we have any experience, that if we've encountered Kant along the way in our lives, maybe we've encountered him only through his most difficult, most opaque work, the groundworks. And you propose we'll find Kant so much more accessible if we consider some of his other works. And I'll just say, I take that point to be proven. You have demonstrated that in this book. It's the first time I read a book about Kant, read anything about Kant, much less read Kant, and thought, wow, I think I'm getting it, and I think I'm finding how it could be genuinely helpful for our lives. So first of all, I just want to say that right off the top, thank you for. I have felt sort of locked outside of the Kantian gate for much of my scholarly life, and genuinely, this is really, really helpful. So thank you for offering us this way in.
It was really fun to write. I'm obviously a big fan of Kant, and I spend a lot of time teaching Kant and talking about him. And that hurdle that you describe is really common. And, honestly, this is partly Kant's own fault for writing in such complicated language. And the groundwork is a very important text, but it's really difficult to read. And, I think it's worth it to slog through it, but not everybody has the time to do that. And I think it's a shame in many ways if people don't get an opportunity to see the sort of the moral theory that underlies it, because it's really very powerful. And I think it's really incredibly useful for trying to make sense of a lot of problems that we face in the contemporary world, and also try to get a handle on how we might think about them and maybe even solve them if we're really ambitious.
Well, so all of that said, I do feel like I want to still ask you some questions about the
Absolutely.
sort of the groundworks, not just the work, but the foundations of some of his thought. And maybe the one of the places that you start is thinking about what we might call philosophical anthropology, what Kant thinks a human being is. And again, I found this really sort of relatable. Now, I should say, relatable as my first book was about sin. I'm a Christian theologian who thinks about sin. So, he has I think he has a level-headed take on just how flawed we are. But you offer this summary early on. You say, here is the very short version of how Kant sees us. He sees us as flawed, vulnerable beings, beset by various natural and social impulses and desires, who are nevertheless free to choose the principles on which we act. And then you suggest that you're going to spend a few chapters explaining that to us. So I wonder if you take a minute or two here, and sort of try to tell us more here. Who and what are we as human beings for Kant?
Yeah. So I'm glad you picked out that sentence. It's actually one of my favorite sentences in the book because I think it does get across what might actually seem like a kind of dichotomy, perhaps in Kant, in that Kant is well known for founding his moral theory on reason, on our capacities for rationality, which he thinks are distinctive of us and the thing that is sort of most central to us. And sometimes people will think that he thinks of us just in that way, as purely rational beings. But that's not the case because, as you mentioned, Kant has a robust and complicated moral anthropology. And that anthropology includes a conception of human beings as subject to what he calls radical evil. He calls this in a later work, or at least a sort of propensity to choose, in some ways, to choose ourselves over morality. So we are in many ways prone to a lot of moral problems. Kant often talks about these in terms of vices as well as evil, but desires and impulses and inclinations, these things we're really familiar with. And that's a really important part of Kant's overall ethical picture. Humans are kind of a mess in a lot of ways. But the other part is that we're capable of so much more. And this is one of the things that I find really appealing about Kant. He is fully aware of and prepared to admit the ways in which human beings are basically a disaster in some sense or other, that we go wrong in a lot of different ways. We stumble, we fall, we're subject to a lot of moral failings, but we always have it within us to do better. And that's the part that I think makes Kant, you said before, like sort of if you need like a ray of hope or some optimism, Kant is confident that that is true. And it's not even just a matter of like he believes it in the sense of like he's optimistic by what he sees around him. He's not really. But he's hopeful in the sense that he believes that because we have that capacity to do better and choose better, then this means that we're all capable of progress. And so I think that kind of tension, like progress is hard for us, and yet it's possible for us, is sort of a central part of the way in which Kant sees the ethical life.
That's really helpful. So we are, and I think that's through the book, this becomes really clear. And again, for me, I often find sort of some of my contemporaries to be like too like Pollyannish. I mean, everybody recognizes that the world's a mess.
Yeah.
But the sort of thought that like, but Kant I think rightly insists that the world is a mess in part because we're a mess.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that he's actually willing to say that. And yet, again, as we'll put cards on the table, as someone who spends a lot of time working with like the Apostle Paul, Paul doesn't necessarily have a lot of hope for how. I mean, well, anyway, that'd be a whole conversation about Paul and his sort of theological hopes for transformation. But Kant has a very particularly modern sort of hope for moral transformation, modern in the sense of an Enlightenment hope in our rationality, that we can sort of reason our way. And those two things, I don't know, I don't find often a thinker who's able to sort of hold those two things together and give an account of how we could both say, no, the problem does lie within, and yet what also lies within is some other sort of faculty that we have that's like a basis for hope of how we might improve.
Yeah. I think this idea of hope in our capacities as individuals and also as communities is really central to Kant's thinking. And it doesn't always get as much airplay as I think it deserves, but it does shape his way of thinking about how we ought to see ourselves, how we ought to see other people, and how we ought to sort of structure our interactions with others, our communities, our both political and social communities, and our sort of ways of thinking about the world. For Kant, hope is a choice. It's something we can do. It's actually something he thinks we're morally required to do. But we can choose to see ourselves and each other and the world through a particular lens. And that is a lens of people who are capable of doing better than we are, who are making a mess of things, but always at all times free to choose otherwise. And that capacity to choose otherwise for Kant is the thing that is also the source of our value. That is what makes us worth it in some sense, or worth the trouble. Humanity is worth the trouble because we are capable of choosing what is good. And to see this in Kant, I think, is to kind of see into the heart of what he's after with his whole ethical system, because it really is a system that's oriented toward progress. He knows that we're never going to make it all the way, certainly not in this life, that sometimes there's forward and backwards progress. It's difficult, but it is something we can do. And this is the part that I find really helpful in, I think, an era right now that we're in, where it's easy to just look around and see, the world being a mess in a variety of ways. There's a lot of vitriol, a lot of sort of negative stuff directed in many different ways on social media and in interactions of various kinds. And I think Kant can serve actually as a really useful antidote for thinking that there's another way to do this. There's another way to live. And this other way to live is our best hope for actually making things better.
Well, let's talk a bit about that other way to live. So there are these like few sort of foundational ideas that you lay out that maybe is where a lot of us get lost with Kant. But I think you explain them in ways that, again, I felt like, sort of like in spite of myself, oh no, maybe I'm understanding this. For example, Kant is famous for having extolled the virtues of the categorical imperative. Yeah. And you took us to Starbucks to help us understand the categorical imperative. And I think that was my first moment of like, oh my goodness, maybe I'm understanding. Do you lay out the Starbucks line example of how we might understand what Kant means by the categorical imperative?
Yeah, absolutely. So many people, what they know about Kant is this categorical imperative, which is this long name for this principle that Kant actually thinks is basically a principle of common sense in a way, which sounds a little bit strange. But it has a bunch of different formulations, 3, 4, 5. It depends on how you count. But the most famous one, which is the one that I talk about first, what's called the universal law formulation. So in the book, I frame this in terms of a way of getting out that what Kant thinks of us in terms of being equal to others. So the universal law formulation gives us something to do. It tells us to universalize our maxims. So a maxim is a principle of action. It's like, okay, I'm going to, get up and go to the gym every morning, or I'm going to, try to eat, less sugar, or whatever it is. These are principles of action. So the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative is an attempt to kind of, it's a way of testing our maxims of actions to see whether they are compatible with seeing ourselves and everybody else as moral equals. And so the Starbucks example is my way of illustrating this. So Kant doesn't ever talk about standing in line. And of course, not everybody stands in line. Different cultures have different ideas about lines or queues, but in cultures where lining up for things, like at Starbucks, is a convention, it's a really good way of seeing what Kant is after with the universal law formulation. And here's how. Suppose that the line is really long. So this happens to me all the time at airports. Like you want coffee and the line at Starbucks is so long. And you're thinking, I would love to be able to cut this line so I have time to get to my gate and so forth. And you think to yourself, could I just like sneak in a little bit further with all these distracted people? So the maxim on which you're acting there is, I'll cut to the front of the line whenever I want to get my coffee faster. If we universalize this, and what Kant means by universalizing is imagining a circumstance in which everybody has the same maxim of action that you do. So imagine an airport where everybody has it as their maxim to cut to the front of the Starbucks line whenever they want their coffee faster. In that situation, it becomes pretty clear that that's not going to work, because if everybody cuts to the front of the line, there's not going to be a line anymore. There's no such thing as a line if everybody is cutting into the front of it. And so what this illustrates is that my maxim of cutting to the front of the line just because I'm in a hurry is a maxim that depends on other people not doing what I'm doing. That I want to be able to act in a way that I'm not willing to extend to other people. And for Kant, this is what shows what's wrong with my thinking, because what I'm doing is thinking of myself in relationship to other people as someone who can make an exception for myself based on my own interests and desires. And Kant thinks that that's the mistake. It's a moral mistake, and for Kant, it's also a rational mistake because he thinks it's not true. I'm just not more important than other people. Everybody wants their caffeine. Everybody wants to get to their gate on time too. And so the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative is a way of sort of, we might say, revealing for myself when my maxims of actions are failing to treat myself as the equals of other people, as opposed to making an exception for myself.
What I love about this example is that it makes clear that it's not just that I don't like the outcome. If everybody was cutting in line, like, oh, well, I wouldn't like that. So, I mean, because often when I would try to teach this to students, that would be their natural instinct. So, oh, well, the categorical imperative is just like, well, if everybody acted that way, would you like the result? I'm like, well, but he's a non-consequentialist. He doesn't care about. He's not telling us that we should decide that we can decide what's right or wrong based on the consequences. There's something more internal, and you say in the book, it's that you end up with an internal logical contradiction. I want to cut a line that if everyone took it upon themselves to cut the line, there would be no line, and it's sort of like internally. Yeah, if we use the universal maxim, if we universalize our maxims, that test will show, will show our maxims, our immoral maxims, to be sort of logically self-defeating or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, to show that what I'm doing is counting on other people not acting for the same kinds of reasons that I am, or not extending them, we might say, the same kind of significance or courtesy. Like, I'm dismissing their reasons for wanting to get their Starbucks and subjugating those to my own. And that's the part that for Kant is the problem. It's not the outcome. It's the way in which I'm thinking of myself and my projects and my needs in relationship to other people and their projects and needs. I'm setting myself above them. And that's the moral problem for Kant.
Is part of the thought also for him as an Enlightenment thinker that he's thinking about moral laws as natural laws, and so they should be universalizable? Part of what makes like Newton's laws work is that like any mass will behave a similar way under acceleration or something like that. Is that part of the idea here? And that if it's not universalizable, then it can't be qualified as it's not a candidate for possibly being a moral law, because it's not even universalizable, which is a characteristic that we would expect any law to have.
There's definitely something to that. I mean, for Kant, the basis for the categorical imperative serving as sort of the ultimate principle of morality has to do with its form. And his argument for this is definitely very complicated. But the idea is that he thinks that the categorical imperative is the form that any sort of rational beings thinking to themselves or reflecting for themselves on their principles of action ought to take. And so that's what generates its sort of status as a law. It has to do with the form that it takes. And a crucial part of that form is that it is universalizable, that it's going to be the same for all rational beings, whoever they are. However you're thinking about yourself as a rational being, Kant thinks your reasoning is going to take this basic form. And because of that, Kant does think that the categorical imperative is applicable to and binding on everyone. Crucially, it's binding on us internally. Kant is very suspicious of moral laws or principles or rules that come from the outside. It's not that we wouldn't have good reason, say, to follow laws that are set for us by our society. We do. But the reasons that we have for following those might be tied to, say, our fear of punishments or threats of, social disapproval. But for Kant, the crucial thing about morality is that its binding force comes from inside of us. It comes from our own reasoning. And that reasoning, right, takes the form of a law. So that's what gives it its necessity. Kant thinks that to be a rational agent is to act in these ways in a way that is rationally necessary. And it's rationally necessary because thinking otherwise for Kant is going to put us in a contradiction. And that contradiction, when it comes to sort of on the practical side is with this idea that we're thinking of ourselves as having a kind of status that we don't actually have. And that's the mistake, the rational mistake that we make.
All right. As you said, that's one of, if I'm following along correctly, one of three sort of statements of the categorical imperative that you walk us through in the book. A second at least formulation that you talk us through is the humanity formulation. Do you want to introduce us to that?
Yes. So this one's my favorite, or at least the one I think is most useful. So even though the universal law formulation is probably the most famous, it's actually one that Kant kind of isn't until he drops, but he sets to the side in his other ethical works. It's really the humanity formulation that shows up more often. So the humanity formulation, and Kant, by the way, thought all of these formulations were equivalent. No one since then has really figured out exactly how, but never mind that. So the humanity formulation says that we always have to act in such a way that we treat humanity, by which Kant means rationality, in ourselves and other people, as he says, always as an end. And to treat us always as an end involves sort of two different parts. One part is to say, well, never treat humanity in yourself or others as what he calls a mere means. And this is basically a prohibition against treating rational beings as objects, as using them or thwarting their rationality. And there's a lot of ways in which this can happen. It can happen through like killing people. It can also happen by lying to them or otherwise trying to interfere with their capacities to use their rationality. But Kant says beyond that, we also have to treat humanity as what he calls an end in a positive sense, which means that we need to treat humanity not just as something not to be interfered with, but something that is valued in a way that we need to promote each other's happiness and to see that as giving us reasons to act. So the humanity formulation is often characterized in terms of respect for dignity. It's kind of a shorthand for a bunch of different things that Kant is saying. But the basic idea behind it is that every rational being has a certain kind of status, a kind of dignity, of value. And our job is to respect it. And we respect each other's dignity or value by treating it in this way, never as a mere means, so never as something to be manipulated or thwarted, and also as something to be promoted or helped. And so for Kant, this gives rise to a whole bunch of different duties, like the ones I mentioned, duties not to lie, not to kill people, not to steal from them, or otherwise thwart their actions. It also gives rise to reasons to help people, to help them achieve the things that they set out to do or they care about. The reasons that we have back to the airport, somebody's, drops their stuff, you stop, you help them pick it up. For Kant, all of those are about how we respect value in other people, but also crucially in ourselves. For Kant, self-respect is very important too. And so the humanity formulation tells us, sort of instructs us that we are always to value these capacities in ourselves and others in ways that shape all of our actions and interactions.
You say something striking in this section of the book. You say, this is what enables me to say that, and I think speaking generally of Kant's sort of conception of human dignity, this is what enables me to say that 2 paintings of dogs playing poker are worth more than one such painting, but prevents me from saying that 2 teenagers playing video games are worth more than one such teenager. Now, maybe I've watched The Good Place too much, or I've hung around too many philosophers, but I'm immediately thinking about trolley problems and all the rest of it, right? Like, that's a really striking statement there, right? That like, why is it that, because I think you're talking about the incommensurability of human worth. And I've always thought of that as like, oh, well, you just can't exchange humans for some other sort of good. But it seems that you're also describing like human value as being like uncountable or something like that. Like, I want to make sure I catch what you're saying here. Is Kant able to think about sort of public goods and saving the many, sacrificing, sacrificing for the sake of the good of all? He does have social social concerns, which we'll get to, I guess, in the third formulation. But
Yeah.
help me understand what you're saying here about the am I right to think about it as like uncountability of like human value or something like that?
Yeah, or unmeasurability, we might say. Yeah.
Mm.
So to have value, the kind of value when he says in the humanity formulation that we need to treat humanity as an end in itself, is to say that we have value of two different kinds. One is what we might call incommensurability, which is what I was after in the painting thing. To say that our value is incommensurable is to say that it can't be compared against the value of another rational being. So on the one hand, this is a very intuitive way of thinking about it. Like if, as people think, well, you can't just, you lose a friend, can you replace your friend? Obviously not in that way, right? In the same way that you can replace an object. So when we say that sort of people are irreplaceable in that common sense way, what's behind that is very much what Kant is after. There is a sense in which each of us has a kind of value that is irreplaceable. And what that means is that certain kinds of ways of thinking about trade-offs across human beings, Kant is going to rule out. And so one of the things about trolley problems, by the way, I should say, I love that Good Place's portrayal of the trolley problem. It's phenomenal since it makes Chidi have to choose between those, is that it's not that Kant wouldn't say that you can steer the trolley onto the tracks with fewer people. It's just not, the reason can't be that 5 lives are worth more than 1. Because that would, for Kant, fail to do justice to the way in which each of us is genuinely irreplaceable or incommensurably valuable. And it is this that, for Kant, blocks, sticking with the trolley problem, the idea that you could push somebody off a bridge to stop a trolley to save others. Because in doing that, you would be treating that person as a mere means to saving the others. And for Kant, that is failing to respect them as having the value. That would be saying to them, your life is worth less than the lives of those 5 others. So Kant's conception of value in that sense blocks that. There's another sense, though, in which Kant thinks that we're valuable. It's part of this treating humanity as an end, or to say that we need to respect humanity, which is to say that our value is absolute or unconditional. And that means that our value doesn't depend on anybody else valuing us or even our valuing of ourselves. So the value that we have is not dependent or conditioned on anything else. So these are sort of two different ways of articulating the kind of value that Kant thinks that we have. And it's really central to his theory because it grounds pretty much every other, all our reasons for treating ourselves and other people in the way that we do.
That's helpful. Thank you for that explanation. All right. We promised ourselves we wouldn't get. I promised you I wouldn't, as you advised, I wouldn't let us get caught in the groundworks. But we have the third formulation.
Yeah, I'll do this one faster.
Then we're off to the races. Kingdom of Ends. Tell us about the Kingdom of Ends.
The Kingdom of Ends, so based on the humanity formulation, the Kingdom of Ends says that we need to act as if we are members of what he calls sort of a Kingdom of Ends, which is a group of people, each of whom has that value that we were just describing, but thinking together about the kinds of principles and the kinds of interactions that will govern their lives together. So you can think of it in some ways as the humanity formulation, working with other people to build a kind of community or society that reflects the value that's described in the humanity formulation. So if folks are familiar with the political theorist John Rawls, the political philosopher, Rawls's theory is very much built up off Kant's Kingdom of Ends formulation.
Is there a theologian in me can't help but hear a sort of resonance? This must come from Kingdom of God thinking that he's encountered in his pietism growing up, right? Just even the phrasing of this, yeah?
Probably so, yeah. Yeah, there's a sense in which it's certainly not a kingdom in the usual sense because each member is their own, is the sort of sovereign in some sense. But yes, I think the language is, yeah.
Yeah, which I take it is true of the kingdom of God as well.
At
some level, right? But it's like a whole world ruled by this sort of rationality that values others as ends. And am I right to think that for Kant, it also maybe, again, I'm hearing a sort of like what theologically we would call apocalypticism, I suppose maybe, or like utopianism or something like that, a sort of like imagination that for him it would sort of take like a whole, to really have this fully flourish, right? We sort of talk about visions of flourishing life. For a fully flourishing life, it doesn't just take the reform of the individual, but it takes a
Yes.
sort of remaking of the social whole. Is that another implication to take from Kingdom of Ends?
Yeah, I think that is right. I think this part of Kant's philosophy is not as well known. I mean, it's well known in his political philosophy, in part, no longer because of Rawls, that Kant has visions of political communities and somewhat utopian visions too, at least in the long haul. But it's not the only type of community out there, because Kant also has a vision of an ethical community that has this shape in which there's a kind of expansion that we could think of as sort of the entire human community functioning together as a kingdom of ends that Kant thinks is what we need to be striving. So it's not all about us as individuals. It is also, for Kant, about building communities in which we can sort of function this way together. And this is in part because Kant thinks that communities can make us better and they can also make us worse. And it matters what kind of community that we're in. And so we need to build the communities that respect each person's value and that enables us to build social structures and institutions that reflect that value and promote it and enable us to live well as rational beings with dignity.
So a lot of what you talk about in the book then become sort of no, they're test cases exactly that would reduce them too small, but they're these pictures of often social life, and I think I was especially drawn, maybe like in our social media age, unsurprisingly, I'm really drawn to some of the examples where you're thinking about sort of approval and disapproval in sort of social situations, and how do we relate to one another when we see one another sort of going off the rails morally, which is to say for Kant, acting irrationally. How do we relate to one another? And I'm trying to we go multiple directions. Well, maybe we'll start with contempt.
Yeah.
You say contemporary philosopher McAllister Bell has made a case for meeting racist contempt with what she calls counter contempt. And I think you rightly sort of suggest, if I'm not mistaken, in the book, that's you can see the evidence of people taking up more or less exactly that strategy on social media, in other sorts of like public discourse. There's something that seems sort of right to that. Fight fire with fire, as it were. You say Kant would not have any time for this. Can you explain why, even in that case, right, it seems like contempt, we wouldn't want to be contemptuous people, but maybe in these cases, it seems right. How do we stand up for what's right if we can't sort of fight contempt with contempt?
Yeah, so this is a place where Kant seems to draw a pretty bright line in the sand, that he thinks that contempt for anyone is not compatible with recognizing their value. And it is a kind of a hard thing to swallow. It's actually a hard thing for Kant to swallow, because he himself is like, look, this is really hard, because there are some people who really seem to deserve contempt, but nevertheless, you can't express it. But Kant also clearly thinks that we should try not to feel it. And here's why. The way that Kant thinks about contempt is basically denying someone their value as a member of the moral community. And so he would distinguish holding someone in contempt from holding them accountable. So holding someone accountable is not just legitimate, but also almost certainly required in Kant's moral scheme, that we can and should hold people accountable for their failures to live up to moral principles. Now, I will say a caveat we can come back to, which is that Kant is actually pretty anti-moralist in the sense that he thinks that most of the time we actually don't know what's motivating people. So we should not be nearly as judgy as we might be inclined to do. But let's just assume that we're talking about a case where it's really clear that the person has done something terrible. And then our question is, how do we respond to them? Kant's answer is, oh, you can respond, but you have to respond in a way that still acknowledges their value, their sort of base value as a rational being. So they still warrant respect. Kant thinks you can't waive that. You can't give it up. No matter how awful you are, you still warrant basic respect as a rational being. So we can't sort of lose sight of that. And the other thing that we can't lose sight of is the person's capacity to do otherwise. So for Kant, what is crucial about our relationship to other people is that we relate to people as fellow rational agents who can choose to do other than they did, who can choose to become better. So this is what I find appealing about this, is it allows us to hold people accountable for their failings, because we assume you could have chosen otherwise, you could have done better than you did. But it also requires us to be sort of hopeful about the possibility that they can choose otherwise in the future. So if we just think about like the phrase that's really common, like do better, which people will say, that's a great Kantian phrase. I think that is basically Kant's attitude that we should be having toward everybody, ourselves and others. Do better, all of us. And so we can do that while still holding them accountable, being angry with them, being disappointed in them. What we can't do, Kant thinks, is treat someone as if they are worthless, hopeless, or otherwise not someone who sort of belongs inside what we might call our moral community. And so for Kant, what contempt does, it is express a view that someone is worthless or not capable of anything else. And that Kant says we cannot do, even if they seem to deserve it.
So in here in the book, you lay out Stephen Darwall's distinction between appraisal respect and recognition respect. Recognition respect, I take it, is what Kant is concerned with here. We have to recognize their humanity, recognize their dignity, recognize them as a rational being who can and should do better. Actually, like. I think Darwall goes to the far. I teach Darwall a lot on this point. I was so glad to see you bring him in on this point. It's so helpful for my. I find him so helpful. This distinction is so helpful for myself, for my students, and I often think that, it's actually part of recognition respect that requires that I actually sometimes withhold appraisal respect. Right, like I have to respect you enough as an agent, as a moral agent, as a rational person, that sometimes that like you said, I need to disapprove of your course of action, or of something you've done, of something you've said, of a project you have invested yourself in that I think is not worthy of investment in. Seems like that's the line that Kant's trying to help us see there. And for him, it sounds like contempt sort of by definition entails withholding of not just appraisal respect, but recognition respect. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. I agree. Darwall's distinction there is incredibly useful. I also use it all the time. And that's it. Contempt is the denial of recognition respect on Kant's view. And that we may not do, because no one can ever forfeit or waive their sort of basic entitlement to recognition respect on Kant's view, no matter how awful they are. But they may well forfeit the right to appraisal respect from us. And it may well be that, as you say, withholding appraisal respect is important because it's a way of marking out what the person has done. And that is an important moral tool. And again, it's one that Kant thinks we need to use carefully, in part because we tend to focus on, as you might say, sort of the logs, the specks in other people's eyes and not the logs in our own. So it also applies to us in many ways. But yeah, sort of holding people to standards is, for Kant, and holding ourselves to standards, one of the ways in which we actually relate to people respectfully. Like to call someone to account for their errors or their sins is, for Kant, a way of actually treating them respectfully, because it is engaging with them as a rational being. So Kant has, in his discussion of contempt, he has a very interesting discussion of how we should engage in sort of disagreeing with people. So Kant, here he's thinking of people's sort of like factual errors or errors in reasoning, not so much their moral errors. But he says we do have a duty to point out people's errors, in part because Kant thinks that we're on this common search for truth. And we're not going to do that. We're not going to get there unless we are willing to point out each other's errors and have our own errors pointed out. But he says we have to do it in a way that preserves the person's respect for their own rational capacities. Like we have to engage in disagreement in a way that presumes that everyone is aiming or seeking truth, and that everyone is capable of of engaging in reasoning. And so that constrains, I think, for Kant, the ways in which we can engage in discourse. Contempt for Kant is not aimed at discourse. It's aimed at feeling superior to others or casting other people out of a community. So respectful discourse for Kant could be angry. It could hold people accountable in a variety of ways, but it must be at its sort of base, working from the presumption that we are all capable of making progress on issues.
I love that reversal that you just invited us to think about, right? It sort of flips the problem on me. When I think about Darwell's distinction, and I think about someone else correcting me, and I then his distinction seems really, really helpful to me, right? Because I can then think, okay, they are not denying me, at least not necessarily, not just by virtue of critiquing me. They are not denying me recognition, respect. They are granting me recognition, respect, in part by considering, by engaging me in the dimension of sort of appraisal respect. I think about I often tell my students about a moment I had in my early 20s that a mentor of mine sort of came to me and she described something she saw me doing and just said, Matt, I just think it's unbecoming of you that you act in this way, right? She's offering me a correction that's actually rooted in her respect for me, right? In her hopes for me that I might do and be better, do better at least.
Yeah.
This is what you're saying. All right. So contempt is out. Is out. Hey, if I'm reading you right, so you also have a chapter on mockery, wherein you talk about a good bit of comedy. And I have to say, as someone who I'm a big fan of comedy and a regular viewer of Saturday Night Live and Stephen Colbert and John Oliver and all the rest of it. Oh man, mockery is a big part of my media diet, and it seems to me that you're probably right. Kant's probably right. He has some concerns about mockery. First of all, maybe we'll start with what are Kant's concerns about mockery, and then it does strike me you leave a tiny little crack open for productive forms of mockery, depending on what's being mocked.
Yeah, I know this. When I talk about Kant on mockery, I do run the risk of making Kant sound really dull. And he's not.
Man. It's all the best comedy.
I know. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there's satire serves many important purposes, no question. And I certainly wouldn't think that Kant is opposed to all of it. What I find interesting about this Kant on mockery is the relationship between mockery and what Kant describes as self-conceit, which is kind of a desire, or one way of thinking about it is a desire to feel superior to people. So mockery can be a really important way of holding people accountable because it can enable people to see things that they wouldn't otherwise see. And mockery can also sometimes make us see things in ourselves that we wouldn't see. It can be a way, when it's done well, of calling attention to things that need to be changed. And I think when it's done that way, there are no Kantian issues about it. The problem, I think Kant thinks, or at least the risk of mockery, is that it very easily slides into contempt. And it can do that without our noticing because mockery is fun. So Kant is not suspicious of pleasure. That's putting it much too strongly. But one of the things that he notes is that there are some ways in which we take pleasure in seeing somebody else brought low that are actually more about us and our desire to feel superior to someone, or the malicious pleasure we might even describe it as seeing somebody that we already dislike mocked or made fun of. And that's the part that Kant thinks is worrying, because if it has its basis in we might describe as a kind of vindictive or malicious joy in seeing bad stuff happen to people we don't like, then Kant thinks that's going to end up, or that's a vice in us. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about satire, mockery, is that those lines can be hard to draw. So we often have a sense, like there are certain things that are okay to mock someone for and certain things that aren't. So one obvious thing is if something is not in a person's control, it seems to be sort of off the table for mockery. And so people often think, look, there's lines that Saturday Night Live shouldn't cross. Maybe they shouldn't mock people, for their weight, right? Or for their, certainly not for a disability or for race. There are certain things that just seem like they shouldn't be on the table for mockery. And that, I think, is an idea that Kant could get on board with. And then the question is, I think for Kant, the interesting question is, how is that mockery actually working? What is it actually using to generate amusement? Is it compatible with granting recognition, respect to the target of the mockery? And I think Kant would say, often it isn't. And sometimes I've noticed this in my own stuff. Sometimes it becomes easy to miss that if you're enjoying it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a common practice in these, in a certain stream of satire that in building up to or in coming back down from like maybe a good moral satire, you throw a quick shot at someone's opinion or someone's appearance rather, right? Here's a quick headshot, let me throw in a one-liner about that. Anyway, it was interesting. I never thought that like thinking about satire with Kant would actually, I think in certain ways it makes you like a more careful observer of comedy, and I think comedy is actually really sort of interesting this way. There's so many things going on, sort of assumptions in the speaker that are what can be assumed with the audience. As you say, sort of what are the axes on which the mockery is sort of working, and asking those questions, I think, makes one a sort of a more careful, thoughtful consumer of comedy. Maybe even I'm not a comedy writer, but I could imagine it might even be the sort of thing that a comedy writer might spend their time thinking about, or at least a Kantian one would. Yeah. All right. We can't talk about Kant without talking about lying. Again, it's one of those places where you're trying to say like, look, come on, it's not all about the Gestapo at the front door, demanding you turn over the person you're harboring. You say there's something, so let's leave that aside, or use it as a springboard if you like. But what should we hear from Kant? Why does Kant care so much about telling the truth?
Yeah. So, the murder at the door, as I argue in the book, is, I think, misunderstood as an example. It's a really weird case in Kant. But the basic idea behind it, Kant thinks, is that lying to people, for whatever your reasons are, good or bad, is a way of sort of manipulating their understanding of the world. It's a way of interfering with their capacity to use their rationality well. And this is true if you're trying to con them out of their life savings. You're obviously manipulating them, because if they knew the truth, they wouldn't hand it over. It's also true when we're just talking about what we might call white lies or benevolent lies, like where you're lying to someone because you don't want to hurt their feelings or you're afraid they'll be upset. Kant thinks in both those cases, what you're doing is sort of imposing your ideas about what is best for the person on them, and doing it in a way that can't be defended in terms of respect for them as a rational agent. Now, crucially, Kant thinks this doesn't mean that we owe everyone the truth. So Kant is actually a fan of candor and reserve. He doesn't think that the mere fact that somebody asks you a question doesn't mean that you have to answer them at all. Kant's point about truth-telling is that when somebody asks you a question and they reasonably expect you to give an answer to it, and you do give an answer, that answer has to be true. So that leaves room for, conventions. Like I say, hey, how you doing, Matt? And you're like, fine, how are you? You might not really be fine, but that's okay, because we know that's not really supposed to be a truthful answer. It allows for jokes. It allows for a lot of things where what you're saying is not strictly speaking true, because it's a question about what the other person is reasonably expecting from you. So what Kant objects to is my deliberately sort of twisting your view of the world, and doing so for reasons that I'm not prepared to share with you. And The sort of the underlying Kant's, what some people might think is obsession with truth, though, has to do with what he takes to be its significance, not just for like what I owe you, but also this moral community that we're trying to build. Because Kant does not think that you can have a community of any kind unless you have trust. And you can't have trust unless you have truth telling. So I think if Kant were like alive today and looking around at all, deep fake videos, all kinds of like fake news, all kinds of this, I think he would think we're in a major crisis of trust. And that's tied to our inability to sort of reasonably expect truth from each other, or our unwillingness to be a truth teller. So Kant's sort of somewhat obsession with truth telling is tied not just to our relationships with one another, but to our broader relationship to the community. Kant thinks that trust is just essential to everything else.
You just hear, and you do a couple times in the book, sort of imagine Kant, sort of in our day, what would he have to say? That thought experiment, though, also brings us to some uncomfortable places with Kant, realizing that he sort of fell short of some of his own ideals, doesn't seem to come to the rational conclusions that would seem to follow from his principles, especially when it comes to issues of gender and race, slavery. How do you, as a Kant scholar, how do you sort of separate the philosophy from the philosopher? Or how do you think about those shortcomings?
So Kant was definitely a racist and a sexist. I mean, I don't think anybody disagrees with this. And it can't just be chalked up to his being a product of his time, because, for instance, he didn't condemn slavery until toward the end of his life, and he was certainly surrounded by abolitionist views. Like, it wasn't as if he wasn't aware that there was opposition to this. And there's been a lot of discussion among Kantians lately, particularly on the question of race and Kant's theory of race, how we reconcile these seemingly different parts of Kant. Because Kant's categorical imperative should, to anybody's reading, call for a kind of egalitarianism that Kant didn't seem to be very interested in practicing in his own life. And then the question is, what do we do with that? I think one of the more interesting ways to think about this has to do with what we might say, it's even predicted by Kant's theory, about the capacities for human beings to engage in self-deception and self-serving rationalization in ways that interfere with good reasoning and our capacity to relate well to other people. So Kant thinks it's sort of built into Kant's theory that our capacity to really act in accordance with the categorical imperative, to really treat other people with dignity, is something in which we throw obstacles in our own paths because we're so motivated to serve our own interests and our own ends that we're capable of twisting situations around, rationalizing what we're doing, and coming up with justifications for it. That if we really were to reflect, wouldn't actually live up to rational standards, but we sort of convince ourselves that this is what we're doing. I think there's a way of interpreting Kant is probably doing that himself. I suspect that Kant, was very confident in his own assessments of the world, and there's some places where he just failed to meet his own standards, which is predictable by Kant's own theory, because Kant's theory predicts that human beings will fail in these ways. And so I think one way to think about this is, Kant's theory can predict why Kant himself held some what we now recognize as morally despicable views. And so Kant should have done better than he did. It's also, a cause for humility, which is another important Kantian virtue, humility about ourselves. Like, it becomes easy for us to look back at figures in the past and be like, well, we would have never done that or thought like that. That's also a mistake because, I think folks are familiar with, say, the Milgram experiments in psychology. No one likes to think that they would have been a, Nazi facilitator had they lived in Germany at that time. But in fact, many of us would have. And that's not a comfortable thing to recognize about ourselves. So I think it also shows us the importance of humility, that what we think we have right about the world right now, in 100, 200, 300 years, it's going to look pretty bad too. And I mean, in some ways you can be like, well, that's good. That means there'll be progress. The people many generations ahead of us will see our mistakes and hopefully correct for some of them.
When it comes to, I want to talk about one more topic, and I've got a wrap up question for you. Manners.
Yeah.
You've written a bit about manners, not just having to do with Kant. And you see that Kant actually sort of has some hope for manners, which for such like a, I don't know, again, depends on what your mental image is of this guy, or of the generic 18th century Prussian in your mind. Maybe it's not the first thing that came to my mind, right? He cares so much about sincerity and so much about the truth and manners. And maybe it's just being like a modern American, a contemporary American. I'm inclined to think manners is just like the height of duplicity. But he thinks, you even used the phrase at some point, something like "fake it till you make it," like that he maybe thinks that seeming like a good person actually helps make me be a better person.
Yeah.
To which I wrote in the margins, really? Yeah. Can you
Yeah.
explain that? Why does Kant have so much hope for manners? And you seem to share some of them. Why do you have hope for manners?
I think the principles of manners, if they're good ones, which not all of them are, or at least etiquette, there are lots of, obviously there are etiquette rules that can't sort of withstand moral scrutiny, but the ones that can, I think, are ones that sort of create social norms behind what are actually moral principles, requiring us to treat people respectfully or gratefully when we're not feeling it. So gratitude is a good case in point. Kant thinks that gratitude is a duty. He knows it's hard. We don't always feel grateful for stuff, but nevertheless, those forms by which we express gratitude are still important. Even if they don't make us feel gratitude later down the line, although Kant seems to think they will, they still sort of acknowledge the importance of gratitude. And so sometimes when we're faking it, we're really trying to be deceptive or manipulative or something, but sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're just being like, yeah, I really should feel grateful here or happy for you. I just can't. But I want to, but I can still use these forms to express this. Because I think Kant shares with a lot of other theorists, including not just like Aristotle, but Confucians and others, this idea that our characters are shaped by the interactions and the rituals that govern those. And we can use this to our collective advantage. So there's a chapter in the book about Kant on dinner parties, which is one of my favorite topics because people can never believe that Kant had things to say about dinner parties, but he does. And it's really interesting because his views about how dinner parties should work are tied to this idea. Well, what are we trying to get at here? And Kant thinks, well, what we're trying to get out of a dinner party is, besides like good food, is sort of, a better understanding of people in the world, and also like a sense of like fellow feeling. Like we want to feel like we're members of a community. And his rules for dinner parties are set up to encourage those. So he's very anti-competitive games because he thinks this like makes us too self-interested, or arguing like, how do you have a dinner party go well? And we're all familiar with the difference between like a really great dinner party and one that was not so great. And the difference there is very often about how well people are prepared to constrain their behaviors in ways that can collectively achieve those ends. So I think Kant thinks of manners as a way of kind of instantiating and like sort of creating a vision of a place where we're just all a little bit better than we are. And I think he thinks that's inspiring. He also calls it beautiful. I think he thinks there's an aesthetic appeal to a world that operates this way. And so it's part of our, we might call our moral striving, to create spaces or worlds in which we're like, oh, this is perhaps what things could be like if only we could get ourselves there.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned Confucius quickly in passing, and it did strike me as I was reading. I was like, oh, maybe this is how you sort of have your, your modern cake and, I don't know, Confuciously eat it too, or whatever, Confucianly eat it too, right? It's sort of like having both this sort of account of the individual, but also this account of sort of social formation through these sorts of social graces. Do you think Kant would recognize political correctness as a regime of social graces?
Well, insofar as political correctness instantiate forms of respect, yes.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think what people often think of as political correctness is just about treating people respectfully. So in that sense, it's easy. Yeah, is it, I think sort of a bigger question that Kant would ask about any social practice is it actually conducive to building the kind of community that we want to build and making progress? And I think for any particular social practice, that's always an open question. will it get us there? In general, Kant is somewhat not distrustful of human nature, but the thing about sincerity, like whether we want sincerity or not depends on what we think people are like. And I think Kant thinks, well, we can't always trust ourselves, like, oh no, like this will all work out. So we need those forms of behavior to constrain us in various ways. So Kant is not anti-constraint. He doesn't necessarily, he's not constraints from the outside, but internally, this idea that we actually need to constrain what we say, how we interact, not because people are watching us or because that's what we're supposed to do, but because it's the best way to instantiate and act on principles of mutual respect. That is very Kantian.
That's great. And I said, as I was reading the book, I really thought like the ways that you were bringing in sort of, comments about microaggressions and thinking through some of this reflection that has led us to sort of develop, like, I never thought of political correctness as like a new set of manners.
Yeah.
And therefore, like, it was interesting. So you helped me think about political correctness. I don't think you used the term, but you helped me think about political correctness as a form of manners, and thereby helped me think about manners as something of like morally significant, which is at least it worked well for this reader.
Great.
All right, last question. I'd love to throw your way. You talk about right towards the end of the book. You talk about you've taught Kant. You've read quite a lot of Kant. You've written quite a bit about Kant. But you say he wouldn't want his philosophy to just be something we think about. He'd want it to be something we live. I wonder, for you, beyond studying and teaching, how has Kant's work impacted your life more personally?
Yeah, that's a great question. My dissertation advisor, for whom I have just tremendous respect and admiration, was a Kantian. And I think that perhaps influenced me more than anything in writing this book, because as we might say, sort of, what Kantianism tells us to do is to sort of maybe give people space and maybe also give people grace in a way that I think is really compelling, which is not the same as like abandoning, like, oh, everybody like go into your own little corner, like, and do your own thing. Because Kant does think that we need to sort of be in relationship with other people, but to do it in a way that acknowledges their rationality really doesn't just try to impose your view on somebody else so hard, right? On so many different dimensions of life. And also to do it in a way that does, as we say, sort of, to give them grace, yourself grace, and to be like, yes, okay, people mess up and people can do better. That I think those two things have so much resonance for everything from like, driving in traffic to, dealing with your teenagers to, working, getting through difficult meetings with colleagues. All of those situations are ones that call for us to sort of, be our best selves in some ways, be more respectful. And so I think for my life, it's that sort of constant challenge, like, how can I do better here in this interaction with this person? That I think Kantian ideals are really, really useful, because this idea that we owe people, for Kant, respect, but also love, which he describes as sort of coming closer, but still keeping your distance. I think he describes a way of being in the world that I think is challenging, but also really appealing. And so I think for me, I do see it as a way of trying to be better in all my different roles in life. And I think that Kant has been helpful for me in doing that.
Well, Karen, thank you so much, like I said, for writing this book, for giving us a sort of, like for me, it felt like a way through the locked gate into this rich world of thought and reflection and, as you say, rich way of life. So thank you for writing the book. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Matt. This was really fun.